Well, good evening, everyone, and I want to just really thank you for having me. And I'm very excited to be here in San Rafael and to be in this congregation, one of, I think, the only sanctuary congregation in Marin County. I've been working with congregations in 4 other counties of the Bay Area, and our numbers of sanctuary congregations has grown from like the time of the election last year was 5 to now 32 that I know of. And so to be able to come here and speak to you guys as one of the anchors, especially anchors here as a congregation here in this area, is really, really important to me. So thank you very much, and I'd love to come back sometime for a worship service here as well. I want to just share a little bit about how how I'm coming to this issue. I'm coming to this issue as someone who is part of the Chinese diaspora. My family has been in migration for somewhere between 150 to 200 years from southern China, and parts of my family lived in Indonesia for 5, 6, they're still there, 6 generations. Another part of my family immigrated to Mexico. My grandfather came to Mexico, and I think that partly why Mexico was probably because it was during the time of the Chinese exclusion laws in the United States. So it was during that period that he ended up in Mexico for about 20 years, until there was also a Chinese exclusion movement during the Great Depression in Mexico, and then he had to return. So I come at it as someone who identifies as being part of a migrating people, and I'm sure probably many of you in this room also may identify with that concept and can think of and call to mind different people in your own family's history who've had to migrate at one time or another, and perhaps not by choice. I come to this work also as someone who's a person of faith. And I'm a United Church of Christ clergy person. I've been ordained for 12 years. I've never worked in a parish, but I've always worked out in community issues. And so I come to this work as someone who believes that the faith communities have a role to play in the larger social movements. Whether we look at the civil rights period, or we look at the abolition period, or the fight for women's rights and the end to child labor, we can look to the ways that faith communities have played a role and have played an important role. And I myself choose to situate myself in that part of the social movement. If I was a lawyer, I might be in the legal side, or a social worker in another side. But I do think there are specific gifts that the faith communities bring to these issues of the key issues of our day. So I specifically came into the issue of immigration because I was a youth minister, and I was working with Asian and Pacific Islander youth at a youth program at the seminary in Berkeley, at the Pacific School of Religion, and I could see over and over again in the lives of high school students how immigration, the issue of immigration, kept coming up in their lives. There was one high school student that we had, Luce, who was like as American as you can be, volleyball team, student government and everything. And then she fell into this deep depression because, as many undocumented students do, she didn't know that she had come to this country when she was 6 months old. And then in her senior year, she realizes that that's what happened. And Lucy is one of those people who ended up giving up on our country and self-deported. She waited till Obama got elected. She waited when she thought immigration reform was going to happen or the DREAM Act was going to happen, and she said, you know what, I'm on my 3rd AA and I'm never going to become a doctor. I'm almost 30 years old. And so she left. She left her family behind. I think about Lucy every time I talk about immigration. I think about another youth that was in our program whose mother was deported when he was 10 years old on Christmas Day. And I didn't know that until we were talking about our life stories, and he had a big X on Christmas because that's never a happy day for him. And he said, my mother was deported, and she's on a 10-year bar. I won't be able to see her until I'm 20. She won't be able to come back. She goes, and we're poor. We don't have money to go and see her. And I thought, what is going on here? And other youth who have lived years separated from their parents, especially their working mothers. So I come to this issue in this way, and our organization, the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, has been working to organize faith communities, primarily in 3 parts of California, around the issues of immigrant justice and mass incarceration, because we believe that faith communities have a role to play in dealing with stigmas. Our teachings talk to us about what it is to be stigmatized and what our perspective is. And I think if we can think of 2 communities that are highly stigmatized in today's world, immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, and those who may have committed crimes. So we're working at looking at those 2 stigmas and seeing how do we as the faith community address these larger issues of immigration and incarceration. I would like to just share with you a couple principles of how we look at the issue of immigration. Then I'm going to get into sanctuary, because I think this will share with you a little bit about where we're coming from. The first thing is, migration is normal. It's a human experience. It doesn't have to create panic. When I say migration, it doesn't have to create panic. That migration is a natural phenomena. When we look at animals, when we look in the natural environment, and we understand ourselves as part of that. The other thing is that migration is sacred. If we look in our religious traditions, the stories of migration are throughout, whether it's people in migration and on the move, or what it means to encounter someone else who was on the move. Our spiritual traditions, talk about the kind of awakening and encounter that can happen in the experience of migration, whether it's Abraham or whether it's the Buddha, who had to leave the palace in order to awaken himself. So we think of a couple things when we look at migration. One is that at the center, we believe that there should be the respect for the human rights of all migrants. The center of our policy should put the human rights and dignity of migrants at the center. For example, that versus the needs of corporations, for example. We believe that migration should be a choice, and it should not be an act of desperation and survival. And we know in the world that we live in, too often it is an act of desperation and survival. The United Nations says last year there were 65 million migrants. Only 1/3 of the 65 million have official refugee status. So that means 2/3 of those people who were displaced last year are trying to figure it out without legal status. We believe that we should honor the right to stay, meaning the right to not migrate. There are millions of migrants in the world who would rather stay home if they could. Think about it. You speak the language, you know the culture, you have community ties, you may have land, your ancestors are buried there, all those reasons why. We need to support, as much as we need to support immigrants who've come here, we need to support people who are fighting to stay home. And there are people who are fighting to stay home, like fighting for their land, like environmental activists, like Berta Cáceres in Honduras, who was fighting for her community to not be polluted, who are getting killed for fighting for the right to stay home. The other issue is that all people should have equal treatment under the laws of the land. Our belief is that the Constitution was not written. How does the words of the Constitution, of the preamble, begin? We the people. It doesn't say we the citizens, right? The Constitution is the law of the land, which is why we believe that the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment apply to people whether or not that they are citizens, that they have the right to remain silent, they have a right to not have a legal search and seizure, they have a right to free speech. So I think that's a really important distinction, because some people believe, even migrants, they think that if I've left my country, I have no rights. But we believe that the law of the land should stand for everyone who is here among us. The other thing I'd like to say in terms of our principles is that we believe that border communities should be demilitarized. We can have borders, we do have borders, we will have borders, but whether or not they have to be militarized is the question. Currently, there is a lot of border militarization already. We have 20,000 troops on the southern border. We spend more on immigration enforcement than on every kind of other federal enforcement, like the DEA, everything else combined. We have decided as a nation that immigrants are our biggest threat, and we have put financial resources to do that. For the sake of border communities, who are even on this side of the border, we believe that the militarized response isn't the right response. So those are a little bit of our principles on how we look, our vision of the ways that migration could look differently. We could have a different approach and a different view of migrants. Clearly today in 2018, that's not happening, right? And it's gotten a lot worse in the last year, and it seems almost every day. There's a little book I encourage people to get. I should have brought you a copy. By a professor from Yale, Timothy Snyder. It's called The Context of Tyranny. No, it's called On Tyranny. Have you seen it? And it's 20 lessons from the 20th century about communities that lived under tyranny, particularly Nazi Germany, but also Italy and other places, and the kind of responses that were needed. And I every day when I see what's happening, it's hard for me not to see the parallels that are happening without being a conspiracy theorist. There were 3 things that stood out to me in the 20 things that he talked about, the 20 lessons. One was he said, do not obey in advance. That people think ahead about the government, what the government wants and what the government will allow and what they won't allow, and then they just freely give it. So I feel like when we talk about sanctuary, often congregations are cautious and they're trying to think in advance, right? And trying to be obedient in advance. So I thought that was an important lesson for us. The second one was to defend institutions. That institutions are really important in preserving democracy, but they can't exist on their own. They have to be defended by people who believe in them. So whether that's the newspaper, or whether there's a Supreme Court, or whether it's Congress. I think for us, we need to also defend faith communities. That faith communities are really important institutions in our communities. I've said over and over again, my goal for the sanctuary movement is that we have one sanctuary congregation in every community. Every city needs to have at least one sanctuary congregation. Because the default is that immigrant communities, when they flip on the TV, the default is that everyone is against you. And so unless we have a community, and by God it should be a faith community, that says the opposite, we are for you, we stand with you, our doors are open to you, what do you need, how can we help you, right? And we just can't be sanctuary and be quiet about it, right? What good does that do to the community that needs to hear it? But we have to defend ourselves in institutions as faith communities to be relevant, not just to our own members, but how are we relevant in serving the communities, our neighbors around us? I also say this word about defending faith communities because the word sanctuary has been under attack. There has been an intentional right-wing attempt to I guess stigmatize the word sanctuary. Are you with me? You agree? Agree. I mean, right after the election, everyone wanted to be a sanctuary congregation. In March, they started saying we're going to punish sanctuary cities, we're going to take away funding, they're harboring criminals, all these kind of things. It has been a very deliberate attack to take away the power of the word sanctuary. And so some school districts, for example, they're not using the word sanctuary. They're voting to become safe havens. I'm not criticizing that. Safe haven is a good word too. But we as the faith community cannot, I believe, cannot back down on the word sanctuary. I mean, what is this called? You know? I mean, the only way we can back down on the word sanctuary is if we no longer use that word to call where we worship. Because fundamentally, this word sanctuary is a religious term. And it is a religious concept. It's a religious term meaning that which is holy. And so when, if we could look back at the book of Numbers, I'm sure Rabbi Lana can share more about this. It was this idea that to protect life in the face of retributive justice, to be able to protect life, to create a city of refuge or a sanctuary when someone was accused of a crime, safe place for them to be until they could get a fair trial. So that it wouldn't be the situation of mob justice, which especially in ancient societies, it was like blood killing, but that there could be a fairness of trial and this principle of protecting life, even the accused. So in our day, how does this apply to our day and age? Our day and age, I would say immigrants cannot get a fair trial. And what I mean by that is that immigrants, undocumented immigrants, can't become documented. If they wanted to, there is no way, pretty much, for 11 million undocumented people to become documented right now. And it doesn't look like there's going to be one this year. Or maybe the next 3. So so basically they are being hunted down. They're being hunted down. I remember interviewing a family that came to San Jose from Arizona, because he said, we're being hunted down. We feel like animals, hiding. Like when they had to leave Arizona, they had to go this really long, circuitous route, trying to avoid every major city so they wouldn't get stopped by ICE, because ICE was stopping cars that had packed with suitcases. So they came to San Jose because they felt San Jose was a sanctuary, that they were going to be safer. So right now, immigrants cannot get a fair trial. And by fair trial, I mean they can't become legal. Some people might ask the question, well, why didn't they come the legal way? That is a common trope, right? So actually, Ben the Ark created a website. I hope it's still up. It's called Could Grandma Get a Green Card Today? And you could type in your information for your grandma, like how old, what year she came, what country she came from, and you can find out, could grandma have come today or not? Basically, our immigration laws today are nothing like our immigration laws 100 years ago. Basically then, unless you were Chinese or from Asia Pacific, basically anyone could come. Today, basically, nobody can come legally. It's the opposite, except for a few exceptions. The exceptions are you have a citizen relative who can sponsor you. If it's a spouse, it might only take a year. If it's a sibling, if I wanted to immigrate my sister legally and say we were from the Philippines, it would be a 20-year wait for legal immigration. So what happens to a lot of people for legal immigration is that my sister's like, mom is already 75 years old. If we wait 20 years, that's really going to be too late. So she might come on a tourist visa and overstay. Meanwhile, our paperwork is in process, and maybe 20 years will come through. So she becomes one of the undocumented, for example. That number of backlog of legal immigrants is 4 million. There are 4 million people on the legal immigration backlog for siblings of citizens, for example. Now that number is an arbitrary number. It's not because we don't have enough INS workers. It's because a number has been set in Congress of how many legal immigrants we can allow every year. And this government, this administration has decided to reduce that number. So that's, I'm not sure how I got on that topic, but so that's when I'm talking about not having a fair trial, not having a way to become legal. That's what legal immigration looks like. So if you're not another way you could come would be is if you're extremely wealthy. If you can invest $500,000 in this country, you can get a visa. You can get a green card, actually, right away. But if you are a laborer, if you are a worker, if you don't have any high-tech, high special skills, there is pretty much no way you're going to get a business-sponsored visa to come here. And in the meantime, you have millions of people, in fact, people from countries of our closest neighbors who find themselves in situations where they cannot feed their families. Usually, it's not their fault. I'm going to just say that. It's usually not their fault. But it's the fault of larger economic policies that have happened to shape the economies of their country. I was in Honduras last year, and I wanted to say hi to my friend Trevor, who's from Honduras also. And we met with communities who would have loved to have stayed, but cannot because they're being displaced from their land. Indigenous, Black, Indigenous Hondurans who are being displaced by their land because their government has given away their territories to a branch of the Hilton Hotel that's built a five-star complex. So that's why you see a lot of Black Hondurans, Garifunas, in Miami, in Houston, in Brooklyn. They have not been able to stay and to be able to make a living and to survive and to support their families. And they will have no way to come the legal way. So what I mean when I say that immigrants can't get a fair hearing today is that there are how do we answer the question of when someone can become an American? I mean, is it when you have citizen kids? Is it when you've been here 20 years? Is it when should it be? What is our answer to that question? For a long time in our country's history, we've had this thing about having migrant labor. I mean, that was the slave trade, right? The slave trade. Then when the slave trade was made illegal, it was labor recruitment from the Philippines, from China, from Japan, from other places, and then Mexico and other places. So the question hasn't been whether or not we needed migrant labor. The question has been, when could you become American? And that's what's on the table today. Trump is saying, oh, we could have migrant labor, we could let them work here 2 years, 3 years, but the question is, when do you get to vote? When can you have a say in this country? When can you become a full member of society? So our goal is that people be able to fully participate, because we feel that's what it means to have a vibrant democracy. That people are here, if you're already here and you're working and you're contributing to the community and your kids are going to the school and you're attending worship services and you're volunteering for the parade and this and that, what does it mean when policies have said you have to be afraid because you could get deported? Or you can't have a say, your voice doesn't matter. So I think this is one of the questions which are on the table right now. It's not whether we can have migrant labor. I think that's going to get worked out. But the question I think we have to fight for is, should people be allowed to have a deeper stake into our communities? So let me talk about the sanctuary movement and what that looks like. The time of the election, I mentioned in the Bay Area we had 5 sanctuary congregations. Some of them had been involved in the 1980s sanctuary movement, which was mostly focused around El Salvador and solidarity with El Salvador. In the last year, we've had 32. Let me give you a picture nationwide. At the time of the election, there were 350 sanctuary congregations who were already working on the issues of deportation. Because as you all probably have heard, the peak for deportations was 2012 under President Obama, which was about 400,000 deportations a year. And so already in 2008, 2012, faith communities were trying to use the strategy of sanctuary as a defense against deportation, as a strategy to offer people who were facing deportation. After the election, it became there's like 1,000 congregations across the country who are now have taken the sanctuary pledge and have signed their congregations up. But also, I say that the definition of what a sanctuary congregation is has changed. It's no longer just a deportation defense strategy to like house someone who has a final order of deportation. It is now a much broader range of activities. In fact, I would even say it's not even the activities of what you do. What sanctuary today means is a commitment. It's like a covenant. It's like, because what we've been telling, what the reality is we don't know what this administration is going to do in March. We don't know by the end of this year what it will look like. So we've asked faith communities to say, can you covenant with the immigrant community to make a pledge of solidarity? Just like a marriage, you don't know what your spouse is going to look like in 5 years, right? So, but it's a pledge of like, whatever happens, the ups and the downs, we're going to stay with you and we're going to walk with you. And and I always tell when I'm marrying couples, I'm like, this is a crazy thing to do, you have to convince me, like why, right? So it's a crazy thing to commit to something when you don't know all the answers. You don't know what all the needs might be. You don't know, can I fulfill those needs? You don't know all the risks that might be involved. But I think I would characterize sanctuary as that, really a faith commitment to a community that we know is under attack. And it's not just the undocumented community that's under attack. They are the most stigmatized. But if you look at the policies that have been implemented this past year, there's been a systematic attack on every form of immigration, meaning the legal side of immigration. Refugees, numbers have been cut. I have a statistic. Yes, I have a statistic here. Even after the refugee ban was struck down, so just a few months ago, they've now implemented new vetting procedures that there are now 40% fewer refugees coming now than when there was the ban. So the H-1B visas, which are the more like what we think of as the high-tech, high-end immigration, there was just an article yesterday saying that they're going to be much more strict on extension, so they don't, so that people can't turn those H-1B visas into green cards and citizenship. So there's really been an effort to really limit, and I can't not think that the effort to limit every form of immigration has something to do with the white supremacist agenda for this country of what America should look like. When the immigration law of 1965 passed under, is it Kennedy? Johnson? Johnson? Signed under Johnson. But it was at the tail end of the civil rights movement, because the United States could no longer uphold its image as this beacon of the free world when people from other countries could see racism through all of our institutions, including our immigration system, which was based on this archaic formula about how many people from your country were here in the 1790s. So it basically favored Germany, France, and England. So when that changed, and they said there would be even quotas across all nations, they never imagined that people from Africa were going to come here. They never imagined that people from Asia were going to come here. This was really for the Southern Europeans, for the Italians and the Portuguese and the Greeks to be able to come. So it's been a big surprise. It's been a big surprise. And we can see from California how it is shaping and changing, and I would say contributing to the economic growth that we've seen in California, the kind of diversity we have. So the sanctuary movement, as I said, is a commitment, first of all, a commitment, a covenant. And there's 4 ways, I think you all have a handout. There's 4 main ways that we have been talking about for faith communities to think about what it means to be a sanctuary congregation. So I want to thank this congregation for just jumping into it to become sanctuary with such a heartfelt response, and then to suddenly be really accompanying the Mejia family so quickly, and just doing that, I think, is a real testament to what your commitments and your faith is. So I want to talk about the 4 ways of sanctuary, and I have kind of put them in order of need. And like this is changing. And if I was giving this presentation in Tucson, Arizona, it might be a different order, and there might be different things. There are sanctuary clusters all over the country, and so a lot of it has to do with your geography. What the biggest needs are for the immigrants in your community and what the opportunities are based on where we're located on the map, the political map of this country and the geographic map. So because we're in California and because we're in the Bay Area, we have put advocacy at the very top. The first thing, the top thing that sanctuary congregations can do. Because we have the opportunity now in California, Marin County, the Bay Area, to create model policies that are resisting the federal agenda. We have that opportunity to try to create some standards and some models that we hope will be copied by other states and by other countries. For example, like San Francisco being a sanctuary city. The fact that they do that and that Chicago did that and other countries gives some reference point for resistance for other places. So we have asked our sanctuary congregations to really throw themselves into this issue of advocacy. Right now, I have very little hope on the federal scope of things. I'm hoping to be surprised. But we have a lot of possibilities on the state and local level to impact the quality of life for our immigrant neighbors by helping to pass policies. Like what kind of policies, for example? Like, this is something we've been involved in the last couple of years, trying to impact the bills in Sacramento. So for example, driver's licenses. They used to have driver's licenses. They were taken away under Gray Davis for 20 years. We just got them back in 2013. This is a quality of life issue and it's also an anti-deportation issue, because if you are licensed, you hopefully will not be getting deported for driving without a license. So let's give people who can pass the test and get insured licenses. That was one thing. The second thing has been health coverage. I'm not sure in this county, but I know like in Alameda County, they began offering Medi-Cal for those who qualify for Medi-Cal regardless of your immigration status. Meaning public health is public health. Everyone needs to be healthy for us all to be healthy. So they said, look, I think of it in the way of like in the 1960s, we were pushing for a society that didn't look at color and race. Well, what if we have policies that don't look at the issue of status, of where you're born? Is that so radical of an idea that we think about that as a possibility? So if I'm an employer of a job, does it matter to me? Should I not want to hire the best person for the job? Or does it matter to me where you were born, what papers you have, how you came to this country, so I think that's a question, that's like a framework question that I want to throw out there in terms of some of the policies. So for example, one of the policies we've been working on with law enforcement has been, we want you to treat, your job is not to analyze people's immigration status. A couple reasons for that. Immigration is a very complex form of law. Immigration and tax law are said to be the two most complicated forms of law. So we're like, just any person should not be analyzing or giving immigration advice. So we're like, law enforcement, if Alana comes and her car has been stolen, I should be asking her, well, what color was your car? Where did you last see it? Do I need to ask her what her immigration status is to do my job? No, right? I don't. So this is what we've been talking about, and this is what sanctuary city policies have meant, is that we provide the services in our city regardless of immigration status, because it is not essential for us to know that. It is not essential for us to do our job and to provide services. If I'm a librarian, I want everybody to read. It doesn't have to be tied to immigration status. There have been steps in our country's legal system that have tried to rope in other institutions to do the work of immigration. And that is, one example is the I-9 forms. Do you know that those of you who are employers, that you have to, is that the I-9 form? Yeah, the I-9 form. You have to verify that someone has authorization to work. So that was an effort And this was something in the 1990s that just got instituted. And faith communities were the last people to resist that. I think it was the Quakers. They said, we're not going to do I-9s. They said, we don't want to do this. Like, why should we be doing immigration business? Why should we be having to read someone's papers and understand it? They're like, that is an irrelevant question to us. So they've been trying to get employers into that. Some governments, like in Georgia, have been trying to get landowners to become immigration agents. Oh, they've said, you can't give utilities. You can't give utility, services like for PG&E or electricity or something, or you can't rent if someone's a doctor. Why is that an issue, right? So, healthcare. I remember we were advocating for this man who finally got to the top of the list to get a kidney replacement. I think it was like 6 years wait, right, to get his kidney replaced. And then USF at the time, he was a steel worker in Berkeley, Pacific Steel. There was a raid on Pacific Steel. When they mean raid, they basically took all the employment files, and then they gave a list to the company and said, you have to fire 300 people. He was one of those 300. And then USF, which was doing the operation, said, we can't give this kidney to him now. And they had their reasons like, well, he might not be able to he might get deported, so what about the follow-up care and, all that stuff, so that was a whole advocacy issue. But I think it's this real question for us of like, does immigration status matter to us? Does it matter to us? Because most people's immigration status is in flux. It's not like your race. It's more like your religion. You could change religion, right? It's more like it's in flux. One term I've heard people use is, I'm a citizen in process. Because for most people who come the legal way, it's like 10 years to become a citizen. So I'm aspiring to become a citizen, but I'm in process. I'm undocumented now, but I'm hoping to become a citizen one day. So it is a fluctuating identity, I guess, or category. So sanctuary advocacy has been a key thing that we have felt has been really important. And I think for this congregation to look at some of the local policies, especially there's been a lot of focus on the sheriffs in general, California sheriffs. And I know that the other counties that we work with, Alameda, San Mateo, San Francisco's okay, Alameda, San Mateo, and Contra Costa, there's a lot of focus right now on the sheriffs of those counties and their implementation of some new laws that have been passed. So advocacy, I think, is key. The other thing I think is advocacy for some of the bigger issues that we should be advocating for, like the Clean Dream Act, against more border enforcement, more budgetary expenditures for that kind of thing. The second category of sanctuary is accompaniment. And that's a lot of like what you've been doing with the Mejia family. And this comes to the principle of proximity. If we want to stand with people, we have to get proximate. We have to develop relationships. We have to understand, what do they need? What do they want? What are they going through? Most of us who are citizens, I was born a citizen, so I am really blind to a lot of what the immigration process is because I never had to go through it. So proximity and relationship and accompaniment is a two-way street. I think it's an opportunity to provide something very concrete to a family in need, but it's also an incredible educational opportunity for the congregation to learn through proximity, to learn by going with and walking alongside. As you guys know, with accompaniment, you'll never know all the answers because every case is different, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to be the expert. But you have to just be committed to walking alongside someone going through the process. In our experience working with accompaniment and other congregations, it's been a variety of kinds of issues. It's been an issue like cases like the Mejia family, someone who gets caught and gets put into detention and accompanying that family to try to stop that deportation. It's been new arrivals who have arrived and are maybe trying to ask for asylum, but they need accompaniment in order to achieve their due process, in order to get an attorney, in order to go to court, in order to resettle. A new form of accompaniment that we're seeing is the issue of helping people get out of detention by sponsorship. And let me just give you a specific example. Well, let me give you a statistic first. Detentions in 2017 rose 43%. So the number of detentions rose 43%, but the number of deportations went down. So that means more people are stuck in detention. I remember during the Obama years, we used to, one of the campaigns was to critique the 34,000 bed mandate. That is a number mandated by Congress of how many immigrants ICE has to have in detention on a given night, 34,000. And we were like, we have to fight that quota, that's ridiculous, like law enforcement shouldn't be having quotas like that. You know, they could pay, but they don't have to actually fill the beds, right? Now we're talking, the bed quota is still there, 34,000, but now we're talking about 44,000 people who are in immigration detention in about 250 detention centers across the country. So the situation it reminds me of is that of my mother-in-law, Betty Kikuchi, who grew up in Vallejo, and then when she was in high school, World War II broke out with Pearl Harbor, and she and everyone else of Japanese American descent were taken to internment camps. So she was taken to a place in Arizona, actually not far from this huge immigration detention center, which I visited on my trip to Arizona in November. Not far from there, on Native American reservation, and she was there as a high school student during World War II. The Quakers developed a program to help get people like her out. I think it was kind of similar to how we think about the Dreamers. We're like, you know, the kids have so much potential, they're wasting away, like let's, So the Quakers devised a program that the government agreed to let people of college age get out of detention early, before the end of the war, get out of internment early, as long as they didn't come to the West Coast. They had to go to the interior of the country. If they could get a sponsor, they would have to have a person who would sponsor them, and then they'd have to enroll in a school that would take them. So that's how my mother-in-law got out. She only had to spend 1 year in the detention camp, and she went to Chicago, where about 20,000 Japanese Americans resettled in Chicago during the war, or after the war, and after the war. So what I see right now is that we have people in detention who need sponsors to get out. There's 3 cases I'm going to tell you that have all happened in the last 5 months that are being accompanied by sanctuary congregations. 2 congregations are in San Mateo, and they heard of this group of transgender women from Central America. They were called the Transgender Caravan. And they were traveling, these 2 women happened to be from Honduras also, and they were traveling up through Mexico, traveling in numbers for safety, because as you know, the journey through Mexico is the most dangerous journey for migrants, and then if you can imagine being a transgender person as well. So they would travel together in packs to get up to the US border, where they presented themselves to immigration saying that they were requesting an application for asylum. The way our country has, this is a choice, the way our country has decided to treat asylum seekers in this day and age is to detain them. By right, asylum seekers have a right to present themselves, but our country has decided to detain asylum seekers. So they were taken to detention. And they have no family in the United States. If they had family in the United States, they could have asked one of their family members to be their sponsor, because you don't have to have papers to be a sponsor, at least so far, to be a sponsor, although it's safer. So we asked these 2 congregations in San Mateo if they were both sanctuary congregations, and they actually had, both of those congregations had a space. They were willing to house someone with a final order of deportation. They had a room ready. But no one have taken that offer yet. No one has gone into physical sanctuary there. And I said, well, instead of just having this empty space, would you consider being the sponsor to, you know, one of these 2 trans women? And they said yes. So one is actually living in the room in the congregation, and one other, actually they're both living in rooms in the congregation. And so they have become, as a sponsor, they're providing room and board, but also they have a team that's helping them get resettled, and one of them should be getting a work permit in the next month or so, and so we'll be able to become more independent. Another person I want to share is the story of Justin. He's from Nigeria. He arrived at what he calls the terrible San Francisco International Airport. And I always think of SFO as really beautiful, right? I was like, oh, the lights and everything. But he can't say SFO without saying the terrible beforehand. And the reason why is he came to this country, I guess it was May, with a valid visa. You know, you have to go through a lot of hoops to even leave your country to come. With a valid visa, he had a tourist visa. He arrived, he didn't anticipate there would be any problems, or he would have called somebody, he said. And at customs, you know, there's two lines, right? The sheep and the goat. And he was put into the line for non-citizens. He was taken into a room, interrogated for 8 hours. His cell phone was taken away. His iPad was taken away. So his regret was he never was able to call his family before he went into customs, because he thought he would just call them when he gets his luggage, right? Interrogated for until 11 o'clock at night. They are doing, at the border, which is the airport is considered a border, there are a lot of extra constitutional things that seem to be allowable. They basically were taking a position of preventative deterrence, that he, as a young person, he's like 30 years old, could overstay his legal visa, might overstay his legal visa. They were predicting what he might do just because he was a young person. He actually happens to be a skilled person. He has a nursing certificate from Australia. He was immediately, not immediately after all that interrogation, no cell phone, no watch, nothing. The next morning he was taken directly to the Richmond detention facility, where he was really stuck, because in the Richmond detention facility, there's no means to make an international phone call. So his poor family, it was 2 weeks before his family found out where he was. And his family was looking in the news, on the web to see if there'd been a plane crash in San Francisco. He was not able to get released for 6 months because he had to wait the mandatory 6 months before you can see a judge, similar to Ugo. At that point, we realized through the visitation that he would be more likely to get a bond. There was no way the judge was going to give him bond if they didn't think he had somewhere to go, right? Because you have to say you're being released. So we were able to ask another congregation in Walnut Creek, who was a sanctuary congregation, would you be Justin's sponsor? Sign this piece of paper. So it was actually someone from the congregation, sign the piece of paper, agree to house him. ICE doesn't even care if you just house them for 3 weeks, really. There's nothing about how long that is. House them, and basically able to help him get out of detention so that now he could actually go and try to find a lawyer, because it was impossible for him to find an attorney while he was detained, and no one to put money on his books to make phone calls. There was no way he could do that. So now he can get out. He's found an attorney who's happy to represent his case. He has a very viable case. And you know, he can start to rebuild his life. So that is one of the other forms of accompaniment that I'm seeing evolve right now, like within the last few months, as we're seeing more and more people stuck in detention. We just got another request from another boy. He's a boy, he just turned 18, is in the Richmond Detention Center. Because he turned 18, he got moved to the adult facility for immigration. The visitor who went to visit, who asked us to try to find a sponsor for him, says he looks like he's 12. Also from Honduras, no family in Honduras or here. So, you know, those are folks like that who were feeling like they're just gonna be stuck in detention forever. There was a man who was released in San Diego. He was in detention for 9 years, in immigration detention. So that's the second form of sanctuary. The third form is networks of protection. And that is kind of what I think this congregation has been doing, of how do immigrant communities know who they can call? Is there a number they can call should there be a problem? Is this sanctuary congregation connected with other institutions in the community so that you could be called on when assistance is needed, whether it's for rapid response or for volunteers or anything? All of that is like, how do we get organized? How do we organize ourselves for when deportation or arrests happen? I don't know if some of you saw that the head of ICE has threatened California, said that California better look out because they're going to be targeting more enforcement on California as punishment for some of the laws like the California Values Act that were passed. So how do we get organized and prepared for that? So that's networks of protection. The fourth thing is housing hospitality. And we used to say physical sanctuary, but this is something that's evolved in the last year because we have, in the network of 32 congregations, we have 5 congregations who have created a physical space in their congregation for someone with a final order of deportation. Someone with a final order of deportation who has like no other doors open to them could request to come into sanctuary in one of those congregations. No one has. No one has yet, for a number of reasons. We have had a couple close cases. One was a family in Santa Cruz who decided to leave on the day they asked her to leave, to deport, and not go into sanctuary, although there was a congregation in Santa Cruz that was willing to offer it because she was afraid that ICE might retaliate against the rest of her family. And not all of them had papers. And we couldn't say that wasn't going to happen. It could happen. So that was her choice. Another reason is I think that's a big reason actually right now that's happened since the Trump administration. Other reasons are that, during the Obama administration there were some sanctuary victories. I think people are a little bit unsure if there will be a victory, or if someone could get stuck living in a congregation for a year or more. And so people have made other choices, whether it was to leave or to go into hiding. So we've kind of gone back to our sanctuary congregations. I'm really glad that those 5 spaces exist, however, because we've had a number of cases, and it's so helpful when we can say, you know what? There are actually 5 spaces you could go to. San Mateo, Hayward, Berkeley, and for the family, I remember there was another man in Salinas who was considering it, but it was all too far. It was a little bit too far from where his family, because part of it is they want to still be able to see their kids and see their families. So having sanctuaries that are willing to offer physical space is very important. With someone with a final order of deportation, where they're housed needs to be, or is recommended to be, in a house of worship. It can't be like in the home of a congregant. I'll just really briefly get into 2 things around that. There was an ICE memo that was written during the Obama years, part of the trying to be a gentler ICE, was to say that ICE should not, a recommendation, conduct a raid or surveillance or arrests in houses of worship, hospitals, or schools, or public demonstration. That is a recommendation. It doesn't mean they won't, it doesn't mean they can't, but they haven't. Even during the Trump, they have not. They've tried to push the edges a little bit, like outside of a congregation in Virginia, but they haven't gone in on someone who with a final order of deportation. The most important protection that we have as congregations who might offer physical sanctuary is the issue of moral and public opinion. ICE doesn't want the bad media display of going into a congregation and taking a family out, but also the possibility of having a rallying place around a family for physical, who are really being prophetic by willing to publicly share their story and to fight and to resist, these policies of deportation. It's really an invitation for congregations to stand with a family that's willing, and to be an ally to a family that's willing to be an accomplice on private sanctuary. So we went back to our congregations that were willing to offer physical sanctuary, and we said, no one's asking for physical sanctuary at the moment, but hold that space. But there are other housing hospitality needs. And one of the things about our geography in California is that there's already an internal migration happening in our nation. There are people who have been in Texas for 10 years, 15 years, who are coming to California. There are people from Georgia who are coming to California because we have more protection in California, because we have more attorneys in California, because we have supportive communities in California. So even if people could come to California for the 1 year or the 2 years to win their case, and then they have their asylum, and then they have their papers, then they can go work, they can go move anywhere they want, and they'll be safe. But there are reasons why people are coming and should come to California. You know, there's a Reuters article where you can look at the immigration courts, and you could there was someone I was talking to who was thinking about moving from Houston. And I said, here, look at this article. It will give you the asylum acceptance rates from Houston. Basically, a 30% acceptance rate on asylum cases. So you can click San Francisco court, 70% acceptance rate on asylum cases. And I said, you decide, what do you want to do? If you come here, we'll try to get you help, but that's something you should think about. So we've talked to congregations to say, how can we support people who may be going through, they don't need to live in a congregation, but they sure do need affordable housing, especially if they're brand new to this country. We've just met a family that we're trying to find a team for that came, you know, they just came on the Greyhound bus to California because they knew it would be better, but they really don't have any family here. So how to find support for them so that they can actually try their best chance to get the due process that they deserve. The other housing hospitality that people have been doing, there's a church in Berkeley, an Episcopal church that has created 2 rooms on their property, which are short-term respite rooms. So they're not far from the detention center. So when someone gets released from detention and we know about it, but they don't have anywhere to go, they need a couple days to figure out, get a bus ticket or get a plane ticket or figure out where they're going, they can stay at this church for up to 3 weeks to figure out where to go. So housing is a Bay Area issue, right? Can you imagine if you're new, if you're an immigrant, if you don't have papers, if you don't have a job? You know, all the shelters have really long lists. In fact, the shelters sometimes call us for someone who's getting released from the shelter after 6 months, like they can only stay for 6 months and trying to find. So I'm really reaching out to the faith community to think about how can we creatively think specifically about refugee or immigrant or housing as a special need in a category. So I'm almost to the end of my time. I think, so that's the 4th thing was physical sanctuary. See if there's anything else. I want to just share one message that I'd like to share with sanctuary congregations is that you don't have to do it alone. I mean, we have some sanctuary congregations that have 40 people at worship, really tiny. The first one in Berkeley is a really tiny campus church by UC Berkeley. And you know, and the pastor's like, we're happy to do sanctuary. In fact, we have a little office here and it has a bathroom. We can do the space. He said, but I'm not going to be able to have enough volunteers. You know, most people are working during the day. And we said, don't worry, you don't have to do it alone. This is the idea of being part of a sanctuary cluster or a network where if there is a case, a sanctuary case, or there are needs, we work together and collectively because different congregations can bring different things. So I think that's the one thing I want to share, and that's my joy in connecting with this congregation because we have done very little work in Marin County just because of capacity, but wanting to reach out and help and support a cluster of congregations out here that may be able to support each other as you all do this work together. So thank you very much. I'll pause there and I'll be happy to take any questions.
To get the handheld mic because Reverend Deborah would love to take any and all questions, and we're here for as long as we want to be here to just receive all of this wisdom that Reverend Lee has to offer us.
This is terrible. I have a question. I know I've just talked the whole time, but there was something really, really important I was supposed to say. And it's the issue of the criminal frame. So sometimes I've talked to congregations about sanctuary, and they're like, well, we will be open to doing sanctuary, and they mean physical sanctuary in this case, but not if they're a criminal. And so my question was a little bit means we need to probe this a little deeper. Because one of the very strategic things in the narrative has been the equation of immigrants and criminals being criminalized. I mean, it was, that's what President Trump ran on, the criminalization of Mexicans, immigrants, where there actually, and I'm going to talk about this in two ways. One is that there actually has been a systematic way to criminalize the act of immigration. Especially once you're deported and you come back, it is now a felony. There's now mandatory jail time. There was one woman that I used to visit in the West County Detention Facility, and she crossed 4 times. They kept jailing her. She went back and she crossed. And she's like, why? Because my daughter is on the other side. So she said, no matter how long you jailed me, I just kept coming back. And she just told the judge that. I can't, And she just said, I'm not going to lie to you. I have crossed the border 4 times, and I've served jail time, and I'm going to cross it again because my daughter is in Kentucky. So the determination of a mother. So she had been felonized. So there is this process of criminalizing immigrants. The other thing that I think happens is sort of criminalizing criminals. And I think if any of you have been aware of the restorative justice movement or some of the criminal prison reform thing, there is this question, there's been this move in the state of California, and I think the shift in public opinion of if you committed a felony or you committed a crime at some point in your life, should you be punished for that the rest of your life? Or is there something called, I've paid my debt to society and I have reformed myself, or the possibility of redemption, the possibility of human transformation? I see some heads nodding because we have had that shift in our concept and our thinking from maybe the mid-90s when it was this whole thing about the war on drugs and the whole criminalization thing. We've kind of seen that in a different way. Where that falls through, where we seem to say, make an exception, is if that person somehow wasn't a citizen. Somehow, if that person was not a citizen, we're like, deport them. So when that person in the congregation asked me, he was from my same denomination actually, I said, does it matter to you what the crime was? Does it matter to you when it was? Does it matter to you if that person is the same person today as they were when they committed the crime? Does it matter to you if that person had a fair trial? Does it matter to you if that person could afford good legal defense? Does it matter to you if this person was a victim of the racism that's embedded in our criminal justice system? Well, maybe, Then you have to think a little bit against that quick judgment to say, oh, not if they're criminals, or criminals, if they're real criminals, they should be deported, that kind of thing. So I'm going to share a story about someone who is facing deportation today. His name is Danny. He's become one of the ambassadors for our organization. He committed a crime. One of the worst we can think of. He killed somebody. But every person and every story has a root cause and a backstory. So Danny came to this country from Laos. Actually, not even Laos. His parents are Laotian. He was born in a refugee camp in the Philippines. He came to this country as a baby, as part of the post-Vietnam, the wave of refugees. So he came as a legal immigrant. A lot of people as refugees, they never became citizens. They didn't know, they didn't have the $1,000 that they needed to do it. They thought they were good, they just didn't do it. He was living in Stockton. There aren't a lot of legal services then in Stockton, maybe not now either. A lot of immigrants and refugees often are in some of the most impoverished zip codes. So he was in Stockton in a very impoverished zip code. Danny says, all I knew was violence. And when he was 17 years old, his brother was killed. And he said, and I did not know how to deal with it. And so I was involved in a retaliation killing of the people I thought killed my brother. He went to jail, juvenile. It was the first time he'd ever been in prison. He was one of those young men who was tried as an adult. And he just last May, he finished serving 20 years. I met him in San Quentin. So he and many of the others, especially who were Asian, who have had refugee status from Cambodia, from Laos, from Vietnam, many of the guys inside, they said, I'm supposed to get out in 2 years, I'm supposed to be done in 3 years, but I have an immigration hold. So because Danny was not a citizen, he has an immigration hold. So when he got out of San Quentin, which is not an easy thing to do, you have to pass the parole board, it's a lot of things. You got to go through that process to be deemed fit to return to society. He was immediately transferred to ICE detention. He served at an ICE detention facility for another 6 months, which, by the way, the men who have been in San Quentin and in ICE detention say, hands down, San Quentin is better than ICE detention. He said we could have contact visits, we had programs, we could see our families, all that, not in immigration detention. So the government, our federal government was trying to deport Danny, still is actually. He is out, and there was recently, he is still here, but in the last month of December, there was a roundup of 100 Cambodians. Same story as Danny. As kids, they got involved in gangs, they did bad stuff as kids. They're not like that now, they're in their 40s. Some of them have already served their time and been back in the community, opened up businesses, got married, but retroactively, they're trying to deport people who have already served their time if they are not citizens, even though they were green card holders. There was an article today my coworker showed me of someone who had become a citizen. He was already a citizen, but in 1996, when he became a citizen, when they took the fingerprints, it wasn't all digitized, and so now they've gone back and digitized him, so they're trying to now revoke his citizenship because of a misdemeanor. So this criminal frame is a very slippery slope. And I really want us to really put our restorative justice frame in that. And when we say, oh, well, it's okay to deport this group, or to deport that group, or let's save the moms, or let's save the dreamers, but we can deport them, we're really just deporting other parts of their family and our family. So I just wanted to make sure I made that a little bit clear about the whole criminal justice, which is why one of our principles on immigration is that the criminal justice and the immigration system should be separate. For example, if you commit a crime, you should go through the criminal justice system, as flawed as it is, you should go through the criminal justice system. We as a community should feel we're safe because you've gone through the criminal justice system. But if someone has gone through the criminal justice system, they should be treated the same regardless of what papers they had. If they're done, they should be done. If we deport them after that, we're adding double jeopardy. We're adding another punishment on top of that. The other thing that they started doing, which I think is really, irresponsible, is now they're just like deporting people accused of crime. So if I feel like I was a victim of a crime, do I want someone just deported, or I'd rather they maybe go through the criminal justice system and that there's some kind of due process? Because the ones that are really scary, or the real violent ones, or whatever, if you just deport them, they probably have connections to get back in. So I really think that's really irresponsible to also do that. We feel like people should either go through the criminal justice system, but the immigration system should be separate, because they are. It's a separate issue. Okay, now we can take questions.
So I want to take questions. I also want to mention that we are working a lot on this in Marin and building the network that Reverend Lee talked about, and she's been connected to helping us build that network. We're happy to answer any questions about what is happening in Marin.
Thank you. You're familiar with the Medea case, and you'll recall that one of the reasons he was let out of detention was because of the community support that he got from Rodef, from the Beach Valley School, from other people. Now he's way away, he's out, and the government has appealed to stay, and we're waiting for the Ninth Circuit to rule whether they're going to lift the stay and deport him, or allow him to stay further for further proceedings. So, if the physical sanctuary idea were to be adopted at Rodef Sholom, I think we can assume that word would get out. It would not be secret. How do you reconcile the credibility of synagogues like Rodef Sholom in the future when we're trying to help other immigrants also get status and deportation, when judges who all talk to each other know that we help violate an earlier stay?
Well, first of all, when someone goes into physical sanctuary, for the most part, it's public. I'm just going to tell you from some of the other examples of physical sanctuary. When someone goes into physical sanctuary, the first thing the congregation does is they send a letter to ICE. And they say, we know you're looking for this person. We know this person you've ordered deported. We're letting you know that they have requested sanctuary in our congregation and we've accepted. So why do they do that? First of all, it's to get around the harboring law. Currently, the law says you cannot hide. So they're saying, we're not hiding. We're telling. In fact, we're telling you first. And what they've done is that sometimes, like in the I just spoke with a pastor who was a pastor in Reno. They contacted ICE first, and they said, we're giving you the opportunity to provide a stay, to change your mind, whatever the legal strategy was, before we go to the media. And in that case in Reno, in 5 days, ICE changed their mind. They didn't want them to go to the media. I can't say that that's not true now, but so the first is ICE, and then the second card we have is the media. Then we're going to organize the media, the community, the public support, and I think with the Mejia case, it sounds to me, and most of the 11 million are in this category, there aren't good legal channels. There aren't good legal channels to fix their case for most 11 million, or they would have already done it. Most of the 11 million are here, but they can't qualify into the narrow confines of asylum, which is very narrow. Some people are arguing need to be rewritten because they were written after World War II, and life is so different now. Persecution is so different now. So most people, so this is what I mean when I think they can't get a fair trial. Like immigrants like them here, there's no way they can fix their status. It's very difficult, right? So I think the idea of physical sanctuary would be an interesting thing if they wanted to fight to be able to elevate the case of it doesn't matter like that. What matters is that this people shouldn't be forced to leave. What matters is that this family shouldn't be torn apart. What matters is that we're standing with them to kind of protect and keep this family together. So your question about would it affect future advocacy cases? I will go to the story of Tucson, Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson. They were a sanctuary church in the 80s. They actually had their pastor got prosecuted and convicted in the 1980s. He never had to, by the way, no congregation has ever been convicted or punished for being part of the sanctuary movement. In the 80s, up until now. There were 15 people, religious leaders and workers, who were convicted in the 80s. But even then, they did not spend a day in jail time. They had to do community service and all this other stuff because of community pressure and public pressure. So Southside Presbyterian had been involved and known by the government in the 80s, and that doesn't stop them. They continue to provide sanctuary today. And they keep doing that. So I don't think it affects your credibility. I think it actually enhances your integrity. Like the judge, it's clear. The judge already knows where you guys are. You're a sanctuary congregation. They know what side you're on. They know what side I'm on. They're doing their job. You're doing your job. I think that would fall into a little bit like trying to anticipate or trying to obey in advance. I would say maybe that's a little bit like that. And I think that the Mejia case, they could look at any of the 5 congregations that are offering space, but of course, where they know people, where they are comfortable, where their family can visit, I think those are all really big considerations. But I think once the case is already public, like they are already a super public case, it'd be very hard for them to hide and to go into the shadows at this point.
That wasn't quite my question.
Oh, sorry.
Why would a judge grant a stay of detention for an immigrant who's advocated for by Rodef Sholom, knowing that Rodef Sholom in earlier cases had used, in his mind, the stay? Yeah. Doesn't that kind of poison the well?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer your thing right, but for a long time, we, as the advocates, have tried to, especially under the Obama administration, tried to have a relationship, try to play by the rules, try to go this way, try to it's really changed. The tenor has really changed. And so I don't think it matters at this point to try to, am I saying, try to do things the right way, because they are basically pulling out all the stops. And I don't think, I think if you're worried about how Rodef Sholom would be able to support another case in the future, it might be another congregation in the sanctuary cluster who is the primary backer or the primary sponsor or the more visible ones. I think there could be other ways around that. I think every time we try to get some kind of a discretionary decision from a judge, there's a strategy involved, right? And we have to think about who's the best, who's the best presenter of this case. So I'm going to leave there. Maybe we could talk a little bit more afterwards.
Hi, Alana, this is a question for you and your relationship with MIC, and it's a Marine question. With the federal revocation of TBS and the threat that is to Salvadoreños, is there any talk or presumed action going to happen? Because a significant portion of the canal is Salvadoreños. On what Marin's response is going to be through the faith communities to help the people at risk from El Salvador who, en masse, are going to be threatened with ICE knocking on their door and being deported. Anything you know about that?
So, thanks, Mike. Shall I stand? Go back here. To that question specifically, I haven't yet heard anything specific to that. And I think that as faith congregations will be starting to talk about that specifically. I can just speak more broadly to how this network has been developing and some of the thought process, which is that, as Reverend Deborah said, Rodef Sholom was one of the first to publicly declare in Marin. I do believe that there's St. Rita's Church in Fairfax. I believe it's also a public sanctuary church. And then there are other churches in the area that maybe haven't publicly declared it. If anyone's here who knows of another public one, please let me know. But who maybe are in a word process or, consider themselves sanctuary, but for a variety of reasons might not have considered going public. So Scott Quinn at MIC, as I mentioned, called Reverend Deborah Lee and myself together in August, and we met with a number of faith congregations to start the conversation, which was basically to encourage all of those faith congregations in attendance to start going through the process that Rodef Sholom had been through, which is defining for themselves what does sanctuary mean to us, and going through the board process if it's going to be public, or at least knowing which of those four categories that Reverend Lee mentioned are we willing to participate in? How do we define ourselves? How are we going to show up as a sanctuary congregation? So that began the conversation, and then we met again to talk about what does it mean to develop this network in conjunction with conversations with the Canal Welcome Center and Canal Alliance. So Scott Quinn, Reverend Scott, said, has been actively in touch with Canal Welcome Center, who organized the Rapid Response Network in Marin, and said, we would love if all the faith institutions in Marin, or the ones willing to participate in sanctuary, were fully organized so we could know how to tap into that network right away and use this organized group of people who care. So we're in the process of all of these faith institutions defining for themselves what sanctuary means. That as faith institutions, we're operating as a network, so we know, if I get a call or if another case comes in, I know this church is willing to do X, Y, and Z. I can make a call right away and say, maybe Rodef isn't the primary people backing this, but we know all of the churches and all of the synagogues and other faith institutions who's on board, and so that there's a very quick method for working together in network. So that's kind of where we are as far as trying to organize as a Marin faith community. And I think we have another meeting set at the end of January to continue that conversation. So that is a great question, Mike, that you raised, and I think something that maybe we'll talk about at that meeting. Is there any follow-up questions about that? Any other questions for Reverend Lee?
Ilana, I'd just like to point out that most of the people in the room are Jews. And people didn't risk criminal convictions to harbor us in Europe. They risked their lives. And for us not to be a sanctuary, including the physical, would be abhorrent to me.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, it just seems to me that we've been through it. We all have relatives, or we know of relatives, of friends that were killed because no one harbored them. And we know that there are many survivors that were harbored. And, it's the Jewish thing to do. It's also a Christian thing to do. But clearly, as Jews, we know we should know.
Thank you. Other questions for Reverend Lee?
I'll speak. I have a big girl voice. I'm just curious, actually. So as a member of the congregation, who came today, who saw this on the internet, where is my name? How does it fit into some network through the congregation? Did y'all hear me?
Is your question, how can you get involved?
Yes.
As an individual and a member of a congregation. So, like I said, and then I'll pass it back to Reverend Lee, because I think she also has lots of ideas for how individuals can get involved. But you can sign up, actually, with Janet and members of, we have a sanctuary team that's been working on this. They've developed a survey, which was developed in conjunction with what we heard from Canal Welcome Center and MIC for what are the current needs. Now, those needs might be expanding and changing, but how can we show up? So as we've been in conversations with people throughout Marin, we've developed an inventory of how we're trying to organize our own community for ways that people can get involved. And I want to pass it, so please sign up for that. And Janet, is it?
Yeah, there's a couple of sign-up sheets, so please add your name, your email, and we'll get in touch with you.
Yeah, so Janet will be out there afterwards, and we'll continue having the conversation, but I do want to pass that question also back.
Sure, thank you. I want to just respond to a couple of questions that were already out there too. I want to just share also, there's a small movement of private sanctuary that's also going on, which is harboring, and where it really is underground. It's not public. We're not telling ICE. It's not it could be in a congregation, but it could also be in a home. But there are people who have come forward who are actually willing to risk that, and so just so that you're aware that is also out there. And around the TPS, that is really devastating. I I think the whole community, the whole country we're trying to figure out a strategy. What is the strategy going to be? But I think one of the strategies, has to do with the employers. A lot of TPS holders they're working. They've been working. They're in the hotel industry, construction, so many things. And I think some advocacy with the employers about continuing. What about the employers being willing to continue to employ beyond the authorization period? I think that's an important angle. And then after the employment piece, it's going to be all the other things we just talked about. There's networks of protection, deportation defense, other things for people who decide to stay or hide or wait or whatever that was going to look like. In terms of other ways people can be involved, be involved in your local sanctuary congregation. That's a great way to plug in. For individuals, other individual things people can do, we're always looking for housing hospitality hosts. And what you said reminds me very much of a family in Alameda who they're a member of Kahila. The wife is Jewish, the husband's Christian, and she said that her mother was saved in France by a Gentile nun. And so she said she felt compelled to open up her home. And their kids are grown, so it was the two of them, and they've taken in this Guatemalan family who I actually met on the first day that the wife and the son arrived from the border. The husband had been living here for 10 years, working and sending money, and it got really bad there, and so he brought for them to come. And but he was living with 10 men. And he was like, I can't bring in my family. This is not acceptable to bring my family in. So he's like, I have nowhere to put them. We have a little emergency housing fund, so we did put them up in a hotel for a few days, and then we just sent out the email to people who are on our housing hospitality list and said, would anybody be willing to house this family for 2 or 3 months until they can figure out what to do next and find something? And so Lily and Dennis, they said yes, and now I think the family's been there for over a year. Because she said now they're like family and she can't think about them not living there anymore. So you never know what will happen, but housing hospitality is one we're looking for. It certainly doesn't have to be a year. Even 2 months or 3 months is fine as a commitment. And then the other thing is their Civic, which is the group that does visitation at the West County Detention Facility on Friday afternoons. They're always looking for more volunteers to visit with detainees who often don't have family or can't communicate with their family because they don't have money. That's another thing. And then I want to invite all of you to come out to the detention facility. We have a prayer service. There's 2 prayer services a month. One is led by Kahila, and it's on Sunday mornings. And then we lead the one on Saturday mornings once a month. So ours is the first Saturdays of the month at 11 at the West County, right across the bridge, right next to Point Pinole in Richmond, the detention facility. And then Kahila's is on the second Sunday of the month, also at 11. So I'd invite you, any of you, to come to that and for inspiration and more learning. Thank you.
I don't know if there are any more questions, but if there aren't, I did have one follow-up to Steve's comment. Because I'm looking at Lynn, and I heard this question from her earlier today, which is one thing we often say in the Jewish community is, our parents, our grandparents were refugees, exactly what Steve had said. What would have happened to our community? And Lynn asked me a question today, which was from somebody else, not from her, that she had heard, and I am wondering how you would answer it, which was, well, is that fair? The Jews were citizens of Nazi Germany. Is it really a parallel? Is it fair for us to use that as a parallel? I happen to agree with how Steve framed it, that of course. But I was curious
how would
how
frame
you
that.
respond to
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. Our world has become more globalized, right, since the 70s. International business is completely globalized. I actually think the concept of citizenship is changing and needs to change. And I think that this concept of this privilege of citizenship nearly needs to be re-examined. I remember I went to an international conference on migration, and there's a little campaign about global citizenship passports and people carrying these global citizenship passports. And I think they have like 4 countries which have signed on to accept these global citizenship passports. Of course, none of the rich countries have accepted it yet. But I think we have to really re-examine and look at that question of citizenship and how is it being redefined. And as people of faith, what is the limitation of citizenship? I grew up in this country with the privilege of citizenship. I had cousins who grew up in other countries, and I always thought, I could have been born there. I could have been born there. You know, the luck of the draw. And so I think as people of faith, we are taught to see beyond nation states, right? And our concern and our care and our understanding of sisterhood and brotherhood goes beyond the limitation of just who we are, our fellow citizens. So that would be my response. And I want to just close with the last, well, first of all, I want to say I have a couple of these on the table outside which talk about our work, and I invite you to read it and check out our website, and happy to support it and to share more about our work with all of you at another time. And I want to just share with that book about tyranny I started with. The third one of the 20 that also stood out to me as being very relevant for our work today is the one that says, be as courageous as you can. And so I think that this opportunity to be involved in Sanctuary is an opportunity for spiritual transformation. It is an act of faith, and we don't go alone. We don't walk alone, but we walk with the one who walks with us that whole way so that we can be as courageous as we can be. So, good night.